We're going to have our next panel, which is a very interesting panel with a great group of panelists that speak about the regulatory barriers to affordable housing, assessing the costs. And this panel is particularly significant because there's so much that we can be doing and there's so much opportunity to make regulatory changes work for affordable housing. Regulatory policies, no matter how well-intentioned, can often act as barriers to affordable housing. The next panel will assess these costs and examine how regulatory policies can promote, not discourage, greater access to affordable homes. So it's a way of thinking about it, not as just a barrier or a negative, but where's the positive in this? What can we do to actually improve the environment and incentivize more affordable housing? Leading the discussion is Carol Galante, who's outstanding, by the way, a former commissioner of the Federal Housing Administration, member of the Terwilliger Foundation Advisory Board, and a member of the faculty at Berkeley. Carol, where are you? Oh, Carol. Oh, there's Carol. Carol is going to introduce her distinguished group of panelists, and we are delighted to have her. Carol Galante.
Thank you. It's hard to be right after the break, but we're going to make this interesting and exciting. So first I want to just introduce the panelists here with me. And we've got a great, interesting, diverse group of folks. So first we have Ashley Swenerton, who was the mayor of Fresno, California, so has a lot to say about areas that are trying to grow and how to get them to grow. Bill Fulton, who is now with Kindler Institute, but is actually, we use his textbook in planning classes, and was former mayor of Ventura. And Vicki Bean from NYU, who has done some really interesting research on this topic of regulatory barriers. Their full bios are in your book, but you're in for some great discussion, I think. And to open us up, we're going to ask Vicki Bean to just take a few minutes to really set the stage on the challenges of regulatory barriers and growth, and then we'll get into a conversation. So Vicki, take it away.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much to Ron and to the Terwilliger Foundation and to Carol. So I was asked to just give a brief overview of where we are. And so where we are in terms of regulatory barriers is that we are in bad shape, right? We are seeing increasing Nimbyism or opposition, whatever you want to call it, in cities and areas across the country. Cities have traditionally been what we think of as growth machines, but that growth is stalling, and that machine is stalling because in as-of-right cities, you're starting to see cities do down zonings and contextual zonings that we always attributed to more exclusionary suburbs. In non-as-of-right, in discretionary land use systems, we're seeing calls across the nation for more layers of review, delays in review, more and more roadblocks in the way. And we're seeing the prevalence and the intensity of land use regulations grow across the country and over time. And we're seeing the consistency of the opposition and the consistency of the imposition of new and more intensive regulations grow. We're also seeing a coalition form where it's not just homeowners concerned about their property values that are opposing new development, but it's a coalition of renters, of homeowners, of affordable housing advocates, of unions, of a wide variety of people opposing new development in coalitions that we've never seen before. Much of that is driven by fear of displacement, as the gentleman's question in the last panel indicated. People are afraid that if you build in my neighborhood, it's going to increase my property values, as Henry mentioned, and increase rents. So renters are opposing development in their neighborhood. Even though they think that supply needs to be added, they don't want it here. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot of what I've come to call supply skepticism, a notion that adding supply won't matter. If we add supply, it all has to be affordable, even though that's not at all economically feasible, that filtering doesn't work or it's too slow, and a fear that if we build more supply, it will just attract more in-migrants to the city, and so we won't get anywhere. The result of that is that metros across the country are not keeping up with demand. What you see here is the top 15 metros across the United States. Across all of those, we've seen population increase of about 7%, but we've only seen the housing supply increase between 2006 and 2015 at about 5.8%. And that's true of metropolitan areas across the country. It's true of Houston, it's true of Austin, it's true of Charlotte. It's not just a coastal problem the way that it's often portrayed. We're seeing metros not keep up with population growth, and these figures actually overstate the extent to which they're meeting population growth, because it doesn't account for the number of non-resident buyers. It doesn't account for the demand for center city places as opposed to places throughout the entire metro. We're seeing, as we talked about in the very first panel, that as you get stricter land use regulations, you see less supply and you see higher prices across the board. No matter how we slice the evidence, we always find higher prices in those more restricted areas. And that's really constraining both the nation's economic growth. So we see research by Hassai and Moretti showing that if we were to open up the supply in the most productive cities across the United States, we could see increases in the real gross national product of about 9% just by opening up those more productive areas. And it has consequences not just for our national productivity and our national ability to spread the wealth and to create more jobs, but also on a lot of individual levels. People priced out of areas where there are jobs, where there is economic growth, don't acquire the skills that people acquire in those areas. In those areas, people tend to live longer, healthier lives than in the areas that are stuck. And there's a great deal more intergenerational upward mobility in many of those areas. So we're seeing across the United States really people being stuck in place. If you look here, this is the fall in mobility. The number of people who have moved in the last year has fallen by half, right? And that is primarily driven by renters, and it's primarily driven by renters who say that the main reason for their move is housing related. So people are very much stuck because we're not providing the housing supply that we need to. And that's having, as Jason Furman, when he chaired the President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, said, these unnecessary and excessive land use regulations are having both national consequences and very personal consequences. And so that's what we're here to try to solve today.
Great, thank you. That's a great setup, and I am a total believer that supply matters and that we absolutely need to have more supply in the right places, and I think that's a really important issue moving forward, particularly with the movement towards more urbanism and the climate change issues. Like, we want more development, but we want it where the jobs are, where there's access to transit, all of that. So I just want to start with you, Bill, and ask, do you see what Vicki laid out as the major barriers, or are there barriers? Is it Nimbyism, which certainly comes up in Vicki's presentation, or do you see other regulatory barriers that are important to get out and talk about?
Well, I think Vicki's basically right. I do think, though, that there is oftentimes there's a discussion of whether there's too much regulation or too little regulation, and not often enough is there a discussion of, do we have the right kind of regulation that to achieve the right outcome, right? So Ashley and I both, I was in California for 30 years now, I'm in Texas, but Ashley and I came from a situation in California where according to McKinsey Global Institute, we're down 2.5 million housing units, or need 3.5 million by 2025 to get even. And my experience in Ventura County, where I lived for 25 years, was that regulation and particularly voter initiatives was used as kind of a blunt instrument, right? To pound down the number of housing units. It didn't really matter what that was related to. And so over time, the number of housing production went down, growth boundaries were imposed. The densities inside the growth boundaries went up some, but not as much as they should have, given the nature of that. And Ventura County is kind of in a crisis now, very much like, I would say a place like Long Island, where you've got very high prices, you've got jobs have stagnated and the young folks are leaving, and really you're living off of intergenerational transfer of houses, people who come in for the amenity, who can bring their own money in for the amenity value. And so in terms of a well-rounded economy, it's really quite a crisis now. That's just come up in the last few weeks, actually, out in Ventura County. Contrast that with Houston, which is widely regarded as like the Wild West with no regulation,
right,
which is actually not true. Houston has no use zoning, okay? But in the absence, one of the things I've found about regulation is in the absence of tools that you ought to have, there's workarounds that are often worse, right? So there's no use zoning, and approvals go pretty quickly, right? So what you see in the fear of gentrification in Houston now, in the close-in cities, in the close-in neighborhoods, is there's two things going on. One is any neighborhood that was built before 1940, the residents have figured out that they can create a historic district, right? And that way they can slow development and block the gentrification, not necessarily the gentrification, but the increased densities, I will say. So 10 or 15 years ago, there was one historic district in Houston. Now there's about 25. The other thing that you see, and this happens particularly in the poorer neighborhoods because this is easier to accomplish, is there is a neighborhood-initiated minimum lot size ordinance that can be created from the ground up. And you see neighborhood activists who are worried about displacement encouraging low-income residents to initiate that in order to block townhome development so that the people who've lived in the neighborhoods have for a long time continued to stay there. Now, both of those are really weird Band-Aids on top of a regulatory system that no one acknowledges exists, and therefore is not created with outcomes in mind. Same thing, by the way, when you talk about affordable housing in Houston with parking and setbacks. Virtually every development, the default development regulation in Houston may not have use zoning, but it's got 25-foot setbacks and ridiculous parking requirements. And so anybody who wants to build an urban project basically has to go in and try to get variances, which sometimes they get and sometimes they don't. So again, I think the issue is not always so much too much regulation or too little, because I've lived in situations which have both. It's a regulatory system that builds up incrementally over time in reaction to things, and it's not built with outcomes in mind.
Great. So I want to come back to Houston, but Ashley, I wanted to ask you really the same question. Do you see Nimbyism, or how do you see the regulatory barriers in the Central Valley? And I neglected to mention you're now head of the Community Valley Foundation out in the Central Valley of California. So thank you for coming and being here.
My pleasure. And I've got a couple of slides.
Oh,
I'd
great.
love to just set the context a little bit for this place called Fresno, California. It is oftentimes overshadowed by a couple of other cities in California you may have heard of. LA, San Francisco, yeah, those places they exist. But I always like to start any conversation about Fresno with this image, because this is a satellite view of the state of California. And for those of us that live in the middle of the state, we often have to remind ourselves that if you are an astronaut or you are God, and you are looking at California, the single largest geographic distinction on the state is this great big bowl in the middle. It's not the congested coastal areas, it's the space in the middle between the Sierra Nevada mountain range and the coastal mountain range that's created the most fertile agricultural production region in the world. And right in the middle of that heartland of California is Fresno. And Fresno did what a lot of places in America and inland parts of the state, and certainly in inland California, did. What you see on the map right now is the first 50 years of the city of Fresno from 1895 to 1945, everything in blue, with the darker blue being the more recent development. What happened in the following 65 years is this. So Fresno today is 110 square miles. We're here in Detroit. I heard earlier that it's 140 square miles here. We're 110 square miles in Fresno, 550,000 people, the 5th largest city in California, the 35th largest city in America. And our story is one of flat, cheap farmland being converted to low-cost, sprawling, greenfield development for decade after decade after decade, times 60 years, without really an underlying economy in place, an export-oriented economy to create the incomes and the jobs needed to take care of all the neighborhoods that were being left behind. So I feel like in many cases in our conversation so far last night and today, we're a little bit in Oppositeville in Fresno, and the conditions that we're talking about are exactly the opposite as what we've experienced in our city. And I want to just make this point because there are a lot of cities like Fresno that are being left out of this conversation about what to do to create more density, transit-oriented development, all those sorts of things. It's a totally different conversation if you are in a place that doesn't have the economy and the jobs underlying the market to support a different type of development. So let me just quickly go to a few other slides. I'm showing you here the blight line in Fresno, which in a period of about 25 or 30 years has moved about 5 miles north. Today we're in a place where just across the river from Fresno, there's a city the size of about 250,000 people being planned just beyond our northern boundary. So this whole push to get discretionary incomes out of the city of Fresno and to our neighboring county is a very real threat for us. Everything in yellow on this slide is a neighborhood of high poverty. Everything in red is extremely high poverty. So between 20 and 100% neighborhoods or households above the poverty line in Fresno. Today, that's about 2/3 of our city limit. So let me this gets to the question, Carol, that you asked. So what do you do if you're Fresno? What do you do if you've sprawled for 60 years? You're a largely agriculturally based economy and services-based economy. And now the world is telling you need to reduce your greenhouse gases. Oh, and by the way, how about dealing with the fact that you have the 2nd highest concentration of poverty of any other large city in the United States? What are the tools you have? Well, in our case in Fresno, it turns out Quicken Loans is not headquartered there. Despite, as mayor, every morning waking up and closing my eyes and wishing really, really hard that some large company would be headquartered in Fresno and say, yeah, we're going to do $3 billion in Fresno to rebuild
Maybe
it.
Amazon.
Say again?
Maybe Amazon.
Maybe Amazon. Although I have a feeling that's not going to go well for Fresno. I'm rooting for Detroit to be successful in that effort. But what are we going to do? Well, what we decided to do in my time in office was we actually looked to regulation and a regulatory scheme that would support the things happening that we wanted to happen. So just quickly, I'll walk you through that. We started with a new general plan, 2035 general plan. That went through and for the first time in the history of the city of Fresno said we're not going to expand our boundaries anymore, number one. Number two, roughly half of investment over 20 years needs to happen in existing neighborhoods. And the other half is going to be in greenfield development, but we're going to phase it and make sure that we don't get ahead of ourselves, number two. Number three, we established transit corridors. The blue lines that you see run the lengths and the widths of the city. The historic part of Fresno, downtown, in the middle of the freeway triangle there at the bottom, are essentially where we have said we want to see these areas converted to mixed-use, multifamily, mixed-income neighborhoods. And so ultimately what we ended up doing after adopting a policy direction through our general plan, we then said, we got to rewrite our development code. Because our development code, which was written in 1964, only envisioned suburban development. And there was no way to actually carry out what our planned land use called for with our development code. So all, by the way, of our friends in the home building community that really didn't like the idea that Fresno wanted to do something a little different than what had worked for them for 50 or 60 years, they said to us, well, you can never build out that vision, Mayor. You can't do it because your development code is broken, it's inconsistent with your planned land use. We said, thank you so much for that feedback. We will rewrite the development code. They said, no, you can't do it, so we did. And then after we got that done and adopted and a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth and oh my God, for the first time in history, our development code is actually in alignment with our planned land use, then the entire home building world said like, yeah, but we got to all come in and get rezoned and this is crazy and you're adding this additional cost, blah, blah, blah. We said, that's okay. We'll take care of that for you. We'll rezone the entire city. Every parcel in one vote on February 4th of 2016, rezone the entire city so that now our zoning is consistent with our development code, which is consistent with our planned land use. And by the way, I failed to mention, When we adopted a new development code, this talk about by right development in California, it's a big conversation. It's been shot down multiple times by single interest groups. And in fact, that entire conversation was inspired by the city of Fresno that adopted by right development in every zone district throughout the entire city. Not just in our transit corridors, not just in employment districts, but in the entire city, we've done by right development. So bottom line of all of this is we know that our market today is completely upside down. You cannot finance conventionally the type of investment that we want to see in our community that brings investment back to inner city Fresno, that reduces our greenhouse gases by 40% over the next 20 years. You can't finance it, right? Yet. But what we can do is at least reduce those regulatory barriers. Now we're trying to figure out how do you actually build subsidy in enough mass and scale to get the market reoriented and actually to build out this vision that we've established. So my last point is this, Carol, and then I'll hand it back to the rest of the group. Last night we heard from the CEO of the Holland Group, who came to actually sent an associate down to Fresno. Earlier this year, we are also the location of the first California high-speed rail station. Assuming that project moves forward, downtown Fresno will be the site of the first high-speed rail station in the US. So it's starting to attract attention from national developers that are interested in TOD. So we had this wonderful visit from this gentleman from the Holland Group. They do amazing projects. We are salivating, like, yes, please come to Fresno, do projects here. By right development, ministerial approval, easy, easy, easy. Great conversation, loved some of our buildings, et cetera. And we got to the end of the day and he says, like, okay, so who's gonna write the check? Where will the subsidy come from? And we're like, well, gosh, if we wait about 5 or 10 years, maybe we can save up enough money from home dollars, or we could get in line for cap and trade dollars from California, and maybe every 3 or 4 years we'll get one project funded, about 60 to 100 units. We are literally gonna run out of time to move the needle the way we need to stop the sprawl, to reduce our greenhouse gases, to reinvest in 2/3 of our city that now is the highest concentration of poverty in the US. Like, we have to figure out a way to finance, to get over this hurdle of the next decade or so, where nothing, frankly, south of the east-west blue line there, nothing pencils out. Nothing does. Right? So we're kind of kidding ourselves that we're just gonna we relax our regulation and everything's just gonna happen for us. That's not the story of Fresno. God bless other places where it is, but we are now trying to tackle the finance challenge in our community.
So I think that's a really, really good point, that you can do all the right things from a regulatory perspective, but you still have to look at the economics and the costs and what people can actually afford. And I would just say that what you're seeing in Fresno, in interesting ways, we're also seeing in San Francisco and Oakland now too, because the construction costs are so high, the municipal fees are so high that, gosh, I thought that was mine. So you've got to create a regulatory environment as a baseline, but then you also do have to create the right economics, whether that's through increasing incomes and jobs, but also some form of tying. This is really a question, as one of the solutions here, we really need to tie public dollars, transportation dollars, infrastructure dollars to the kinds of development we want to see happen. And so I'm going to open that up for all of you, and Bill, why don't you go, and then I want to hear what New York is doing.
I was thinking about this. I think it's a question, it's always a question of, you always see when it comes to the external cost, whether that's infrastructure or whatever, you always see the government and the developers trying to push that cost on each other, right? Either that's why home builders love to promote taxes, that's why governments love to impose impact fees over the objections of home builders. And I think that you have to reach, you kind of have to reach equilibrium about that. If in a strong market you have impact fees, what can you really afford? How will the project still work? And then how do you cover that off of tax revenue? You see this in the Bay Area with affordable housing too. It's easy to load on such an enormous requirement that the result will be no development, which of course may be the goal of some of the people promoting.
That has become the goal for some people.
Right, yeah, if you have to build, as you said, if you have to build all affordable housing, if you're required to do that, no one's going to do it, right? But you can feel good about it while also achieving the covert goal of not having any development. So in that sense, it's always a public-private partnership where we've been trained in California, I'll speak as a Californian, we've been trained 40 years of Prop 13 that all the costs should be pushed on the developer, growth must pay for itself, et cetera, right? Not only must growth pay for itself, growth must pay for also all the past sins of all the developers who got away with something in the past, right? So I think that in that sense, there has to be a recognized public-private partnership where the developers can absorb some of the cost, but if it kills the projects, then that cost has to be picked up somewhere else.
Yeah, and I want to just make a plug for a tool that we've developed at the Turner Center just for a few cities in the Bay Area. Vicki has seen it. It's called our Housing Dashboard. I mean, part of the challenge that I see is that your typical planning director and city council, right, they have a hard time figuring out, even if they believe that you don't want to put too much cost on the developer so that you kill the goose that lays the golden egg, but they don't have a sophistication in their development staffs or in their their planning departments to say where should those lines be drawn, how do we think about this? And so having publicly accessible tools that are credible, that actually help and pretty easy to use, that help people see, if you add this much inclusionary housing, 50% of zero is zero, right? So you can have 50% affordable housing, but you're not going to get any. So, Vicki, I just, I feel like we're kindred spirits in practice and academia and two very expensive housing markets. And so, what, and you were at HPD. I neglected also to mention chairing, the Commission for Housing in New York City before you went back into academia. So, what were you doing in New York around these regulatory barriers and the NIMBY questions that, might have been successful?
Mm-hmm. So, a couple of things. I mean, when I was Housing Commissioner, we passed two quite dramatic legislation. One was an inclusionary zoning program that required between 20 and 30% affordable housing, permanently affordable housing, in any area where there was an upzoning that added more density. That was accompanied by some tax incentives, so there was, both public-private financing going into that. I think the most important thing that we learned in the process of drafting that was that we hired an independent consultant to work with all the stakeholders, to talk about what it costs to buy the land, to build to build a block and plank, to build a high-rise, all of that. They reached out across the city to a wide variety of interest groups and stakeholders, and then came together with a projection of what really could be afforded, what was affordable, what could result in production, and what wouldn't tamp down production. And I think that the credibility that wide engagement and an objective outside role of a consultant was really important. One of the things that certainly I learned in that process is that it's built very heavily upon the availability of 4% credits. And if 4% credits go away, then we don't have a mechanism for adjusting that inclusionary zoning as required. So it's not only important to make sure that you're not asking for too much in today's economics, but to build in flexibility over the long run. The other thing that we did, which I think is actually more of an unsung accomplishment, was that we passed a rezoning called Zoning for Quality and Affordability, which was the first major change in our zoning ordinance since 1960. And it basically was a very surgical approach, looking at all of the places where we didn't think the zoning got it right or the regulations got it right. So parking restrictions, height restrictions on the first floor, right, which were really limiting how our buildings were able to attract retail, which is incredibly important to their bottom line. Things like setbacks, and just a lot of really detailed, but correcting those mistakes, because it's very hard to go back in and correct a mistake, right? Or to update a regulation. They just tend to get layered onto each other, and you never fix, you just work around, and then it all gets much too complicated. And before I went back into academia, when I was seeing the projects come in, routinely my developers were telling me, I got 30 more units. I was able to build, 50 more units because I wasn't paying $50,000 for a parking space that sat empty. And so I think that very surgical approach is really helpful. It's really painful because then you've basically gored everybody's ox, and we had the distinction of having almost every one of the 59 community districts in New York City vote against us, but still managed to get it passed because it was a widespread and really comprehensive approach to fixing regulations that would allow better development and allow more affordable development.
And the mayor still got reelected.
And the mayor still got reelected.
So
right?
I'd consider that quite a success. Bill, I want to go back to Houston. We just had the hurricanes. You couldn't pick up a newspaper without talking or seeing written that, this was made worse by the lack of regulatory controls and zoning in Houston. And so to your point about how you get this right, and to your point about how you get to nuance, can you speak to your views on that, about how do we get it right?
Oh, I think Houston is talk about an inflection point, right? As I say, in Houston, we have regulations that require everyone to build too much parking everywhere all the time. However, apparently, as we learned during Hurricane Harvey, it's perfectly okay to build thousands of houses in the footprint of a reservoir, right? Which is something that certainly hasn't happened anywhere else in the country. So I think it's going to be a very interesting question in Houston now as to can we right-size the regulation. There's I would say in recovering from Harvey, there's three things that are in play. One is more hard infrastructure, which of course is what Houston is traditionally good at. One is better green infrastructure, and there'll be some of that because the urban greenways effort in Houston is now very robust. And the third one is right-sizing the land use regulation. So number one, figuring out where the heck the floodplain is, which no one knows anymore. I've lived in Houston for 3 years. There's been 3 500-year floods, right? I'm old, but I'm not that old, right? Is it? And the other observation I would make about Houston's not going to buy out a lot of properties, and that's a pretty expensive way to prohibit development, right? Allowing developers to build, then allowing homeowners to buy, then buying them out. Isn't it simpler to prohibit the development in the first place? Or buy the land, the undeveloped land. This is going to be one of the most interesting inflection points in American history in terms of land use regulation as to whether a city that is emotionally hostile to regulation embraces the right kind of regulation, not only to protect itself from future flooding, and also to protect both itself and FEMA from future expense. I don't know what's going to happen.
So Ashley, I want to turn back to the question of Nimbyism because I think part of what Vicki was pointing out, and I certainly see in San Francisco, is you've got new coalitions of people who don't want development for a variety of reasons that, in the years that I spent in front of city council meetings getting affordable housing developments approved, it was generally the neighbors, not in my literally not in my backyard. But you started to mention some different dynamics of special interests in Fresno. You mentioned labor. It seems to me that we, younger people who are concerned about gentrification or neighborhood gentrification issues, we have a whole range of new things coming together to say development is bad. Can you speak to, the special interests that you saw and ways that you see overcoming those?
Yeah, I'll certainly try to. And again, just imagine everything you hear about coastal California, just kind of do the opposite of that, and that is the Central Valley. And so our special interests that were really coming unglued at this sort of sweeping shift in land use policy and development regulation were people who liked the way things were, which was we oversupply the housing market year after year after year. And at the very first sign of a neighborhood showing a little bit of wear and tear, or a school showing a little bit of wear and tear, people with discretionary income get up and they move out. So, so our special interest struggle was with the industry, who that's just all they knew, and certainly they're not bad people. It's just what they had known. I do think, and let me just say, I think we were able to pull the vision and the regulations together just before we started to see people being concerned about the conversation about infill and revitalization of our transit corridors and in downtown. But one thing that we did, and we'll, as we move forward as a community in building out this vision, data, I think, is going to be really critical, and I appreciate the tools, Carol, that your team and you are developing. But in the case of Fresno, for example, we have such a high ceiling on zoned capacity along our transit corridors in downtown. So 20,000 units are already zoned and environmentally cleared, and we now offer to the market as by right development if you're along transit corridors and in downtown. And what we did is we found places to tuck those units in that weren't impacting existing neighborhoods. So those transit corridors that we created with our zone districts are actually just single-story, kind of old-fashioned 1960s, 70s, and 80s commercial strip properties that, it's a little, there aren't neighborhoods backing up immediately to it. So converting those properties and adding that transit corridor right along the middle and connecting the wealthier into the community in the north to the job center in downtown in the south. We have anchor institutions along the way, along the transit corridor. That was sort of the elegant solution for how we could introduce a new type of development and do so in a manner that really didn't get a negative reaction from residents. And then we just did everything in advance. We did about 7 years of community engagement before we actually adopted our plans or regulations in our rezone of the city. When I think about going forward and how to deal with the really understandably intense voices on different sides of the issue, not just in Fresno, but around the state, I mean, all I can think of is just the word of persistence. Like, you just have to keep engaging. We just, in Fresno, for example, did the largest participatory budgeting process in the history of our country that we can find. 529 residents involved in a 90-day process to appropriate $70 million from the state's cap and trade program to try to reinvest in our older neighborhoods in our downtown. 529 people. I mean, it was absolute nuts. And in the end, in the final vote, we had a near unanimous vote of how to appropriate those dollars. So, I mean, it just is slugging it out. And I do think, and this is my last point, I do think we are due for a pendulum shift and swing. The Bay Area is at a crisis point. It is crazy what is happening in the Bay Area. And so I just think we have to keep pushing, and that we will see a bit of a pendulum swing. And then to Bill's point, making sure that the opening that gets created in that pendulum swing is the right approach. It's not a no regulation or too much regulation, it's the right regulation. And that'll be really key, and we just have to be on guard and look for that moment, and then move in swiftly with innovative ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, and I want to move on to other regions, but I do think if you start to think about the Bay Area of California as a mega region, and Stockton, Fresno, all these places in the Central Valley, with the advent of autonomous vehicles and the pressures that are so extreme in the Bay Area to produce more housing, given all the jobs that. I can't imagine that at some point in the future we are not going to see a shift and recognize that we are a mega region and plan for it well, as opposed to, allowing it to happen via sprawl. So stick with it. Vicki, I want to go back to you on the gentrification question, because I do see that as a newish, at least these past couple of years, rationale for Nimbyism, and something I'm very concerned about. And how is New York thinking about dealing with this? Because I would say we're struggling with it in the Bay Area for sure.
Well, I think every city is struggling with it, in part because while we are trying pilots, like Henry mentioned earlier, there's no real proof as to what works and doesn't work yet. So I think one of the things is that we've got to put into place pilots that we can measure their success and be able to use those to assure people that we do have ways of keeping people in place. New York is trying something, I think, fairly monumental, which is it is guaranteeing an attorney for every tenant faced, every low-income tenant faced with an eviction notice. And that is, I mean, we're seeing, as Matt Desmond's book pointed out, we're seeing enormous amounts of eviction and churn in apartments. And so we're experimenting with, well, can lawyers make a difference in that situation, and at what cost, obviously. So that's one thing. A second thing, obviously we have to deal with the home ownership problem and the fact that property taxes may increase, and we need ways, we need circuit breakers, we need ways of allowing people to stay in place. But one of the things that I think is so difficult is that when people talk about displacement, they're not just talking about, I may have to leave. They're talking about, I may stay, but it doesn't feel like the same place to me. And one of the reasons why it doesn't feel the same place to me is my retail closed down, or my social service groups, or my church closed down. And so we need to find ways of bucking up that retail and of bucking up those other parts of what people feel is a community. I do want to make one other point, which is related, but also goes back to something that Ashley said. In terms of the coalitions that are developing against this and that are using gentrification and the fear of displacement as one of the main concerns, is that we really have to be careful about the perfect becoming the enemy of the good. I mean, I was struck by Chris's slides and Paige's slides about no starter homes. And one of my lowest moments as commissioner was I was proposing to lower the required minimum apartment size from 450 square feet down to 300 square feet so that you could have a studio that somebody, you know, young people or others could live in. And somebody stood up and called me a murderer, because if people have to live in 300 square feet, it's like you're murdering them. And I'm like, no, it's like I'm keeping them from being homeless, right? But the perfect, we'd rather offer low-income people, a 450 square foot apartment. Sure, we'd love to, but that's not the world that we live in.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that, because there's all kinds of building code requirements that just have accreted over the years, right? Every zoning and building codes, everything from minimum unit sizes to, do we really have to have windows in every bedroom, right? Like in California, I get that we were trying to deal with like tenement housing, but when you think about it, people have grand family rooms that don't have windows in them. So like, why do you have these kind of funny code requirements? And we should look at all that, in terms of what adds to the cost. We're gonna open it up here for questions, but I want to get Bill, you in on one more point on this, not just gentrification, but the broad range of Nimbyism, and looking for some optimism here. I don't know, I certainly see in the Bay Area that there's a whole YIMBY movement now of younger people who are like, wait a minute, I want to be able to live in this community too, and who are very, very active, have become very important allies at the state level to try to get the state of California to do more by right zoning, that kind of thing. What are you seeing, both in Houston and your prior work in Southern California? Do you feel some positive, there are some positive coalitions for new development too?
There are some. For those of you who followed Measure S in Los Angeles, that was the big downzoning. That was a classic NIMBY initiative, got completely whacked, about 2/3. I will say though, in Southern California, and I experienced this in my previous job as planning director of San Diego, there's been a very, very discouraging NIMBY attitude toward dense housing around transit. If you're going to put dense housing anywhere in Los Angeles or Orange County or San Diego, it certainly makes sense to do it there. And yet, even that, along the Expo line in Santa Monica, for example, and along the new Mid-Coast light rail line going to UCSD from downtown San Diego, you've seen a lot of homeowner resistance to that, and that hasn't gone away yet, unfortunately.
Got it. Well, I guess I try to be an eternal optimist because you can't be in the development business unless you have optimism. But I do think sometimes necessity is the mother of invention, and things have gotten so desperate that I do hope that some of these solutions that we've talked about can see the light of day and make a change in communities. We're going to have to end it there. I've been told we don't have time for questions, but we'll be around, so feel free to nail us, and we'll be happy to answer questions or take comments. Thank you.
Thank you.